Stay free. See it first on Rumble.
Last time round, I think where you were particularly effective was recognizing that the Democrats were not addressing the kind of psychic charge and potency of Donald Trump because they essentially are tied to the same corporate interests that have undergirded mainstream politics for a long time. Why do you think that Trump is once more at the forefront of the news cycle? What does that tell us about the failings of the Democratic Party? And what does it tell us about the political landscape more broadly, that Trump continues to dominate, supported essentially by both sides, particularly from a media perspective, because they are all he talks about? And how are you going to penetrate that space and give people hope that there's an alternative to Donald Trump, acknowledging that the reason that Donald Trump is so successful and effective is because of centralized corruption that I'm sure that you would oppose also?
Yeah, I don't disagree with your analysis. So this is the deal. Many people thought that if we could only defeat Trump in 2020, that the problems would be over. And we now realize that it was more like a tumor that had already metastasized. There's this plague of hatred. So many of the darkest aspects of American consciousness that were harnessed by him for political purposes had already metastasized, and they have not gone away. But we have to go back to what made this country so vulnerable to him to begin with. And that has to do with the fact that, as Franklin Roosevelt said, we don't have to worry about a fascist takeover as long as democracy delivers on its blessings. This country should never have been so vulnerable to a man like Donald Trump. We were so vulnerable in large part because democracy had not. If democracy was delivering on its blessings, then the average American would have the same things that the average European and every other advanced European nation has, such as universal health care, such as a guaranteed livable wage, such as easy access to a higher education, such as free childcare, such as paternity and maternity leave. So our immune system was so weakened because of this corruption, neoliberalism, trickle-down economics, whatever you want to call it. When you have 80% of people in a country who are living 60% living paycheck to paycheck, 80% of Americans living with chronic economic struggle, then that forms a kind of petri dish out of which all manner of personal and societal dysfunction is inevitable, whether it's Donald Trump or anyone else. Now, since this last election, and I'm very glad that he was defeated in 2020, but we have not provided the massive infusion of economic hope and opportunity to the American people that will guarantee that we will not be vulnerable to him in 2024. And that's why an agenda that does not just present an alleviation of economic stress, but which actually proposes an economic U-turn in this country, actually proposes fundamental economic reform, is not only the way to beat him in 24, but it's also the way to repair this country.
A lot of people watching this right now will think that Donald Trump is absolutely fantastic, that Donald Trump is the solution, that Donald Trump wants to drain the swamp, that Donald Trump speaks for them. You know that Donald Trump's success was significantly built on blue-collar votes, that he experienced great success in poor communities. A lot of people watching this right now, I know, will not want to hear Donald Trump attacked. What I try to offer here is the opportunity to address the conditions that are not being addressed by either side. That Biden promised to rein in Big Pharma, then offered a mealy-mouthed, compromised bill that will not meaningfully impact the pharmaceutical industry at all. That no one is talking about a peace deal between Ukraine and Russia. And in fact, it's apparent that that process was possibly interrupted. What I feel like, even, and as a person that lives in Europe, things ain't so great here either. We similarly toil under centralized government that appear to operate on behalf of corporate interests rather than the people that put them into power. Sure, we might have some comparative compromises and some little pieces of welfare here or there that you might think were a reflection of a more enlightened governmental perspective, but it's the same deal basically. Corporate interests set the deal. We basically think politicians are corrupt. They got second jobs. They own shares in this or that. They're connected to hedge funds. And Marianne, what I think is required is a kind of radicalism in the political conversation, a kind of boldness of vision that now we have seen that, we can certainly assess what Trump did in office and the failings and where he plainly administered on behalf of economic elites. But we have to accept that since then, Biden said to his donors, as you are obviously aware, you got nothing to worry about with me in office. You know that he's funded by big tech, Wall Street, big pharma, or at least the Democrat Party largely are. So how, from within this system, do you ever make significant changes? What is your agenda that would appeal to people that would happily vote for Donald Trump because of his anti-establishment stance?
Well, in 2016, Donald Trump said to the American people, your rage is legitimate. And he was correct. And that's the same thing that Bernie Sanders said. Both of them told the American people, your pain is valid, your anger about it, you are living at the effect of a rigged economic system. The difference is that Donald Trump was saying it because he's master of the art of the deal. He knew it's what people wanted to hear. Bernie Sanders actually meant it. So yes, he spoke to people, as did Bernie. But once he got into office, I think a lot of those people have seen how conned they were by the things that he said. There is a radicalism the way that Franklin Roosevelt said. He said, I feel we must become fairly radical for a generation. You're right. It's in my country, it would be considered a radical Americanism, that it would be a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, rather than a government of the corporations, by the corporations, and for the corporations. Now, I'm concerned, as you are, that the Democratic Party is trying to have it both ways. The Democratic Party sees people, and I don't want to say the Democratic Party, the Democratic establishment elite sees the pain and wants to address it on the periphery, but they know more than the Republicans sometimes are willing to challenge the underlying corporate forces that make the return of that pain always inevitable. To that extent, I am the candidate who is saying much of what you're saying, and it's also why the Democratic corporate elite does not want it. Now, this is the deal. When you ask how are you going to break through, history has never been made by people who say that it can't be done. You know, I look at it a lot like the Berlin Wall. If you ask, well, what made the Berlin Wall fall? Well, if you look at it on the outside, somebody made a phone call to somebody else and it was misunderstood, and then they called the gate and then they opened the gate. But that's not what really made the Berlin Wall fall. What really made is just the thousands and thousands and thousands of efforts made. You just keep pushing. You know, I saw somebody on television the other day talking about how we're going to bring down an unjust system, the economic and political system that you're talking about. And he said somebody is going to break through. We don't have time to think about, well, would this person do it? Would that do it? All of it's going to do it. Every conversation, every podcast, every labor effort, every election of a progressive, you just keep pushing. You just keep pushing. To me, if we go into cynicism, if we go into, no, it can't be done, that's acquiescing to the system. And I think we just need to keep pushing. And I believe with all my heart, somebody's going to break through. And what point of breakthrough it's going to be is not what's as relevant as the fact that all of us just need to keep pushing in whatever way we can, and supporting other people who are doing it too.
I agree with you, and I'm excited by you as a candidate, as you know, because of your spiritual beliefs and credentials and your optimism and your credentials as a teacher, Marianne. We spoke to Brianna Joy Gray yesterday, who was prominent in Bernie's campaigning. And, you know, and I know that Bernie he was stiffed by rigged systems within the Democrat Party, the elite that you described. And Bernie, of course, was a long-standing independent candidate before aligning with the Democrats. Do you not think that the sort of popular support being garnered by people like whether it's the Tea Party, Libertarian right, perhaps in the great form of Donald Trump, or figures like Bernie with his kind of populist support, these are ultimately independent style candidates that are sort of operating within the party system. Do you not think that there might be a future for a sort of a confederacy or alliance, at least, if that's an incendiary word, of independent candidates challenging systemic corruption that can incorporate both the traditional values typically enshrined by the Republican right and the progressive values, should we call them, that are seen within the social justice movement? Because I feel like, you know, I am optimistic, but I feel that new alliances, tolerance, open-heartedness are going to have to be embraced if we are going to confront the sort of entrenchant systemic corporate interests that seem very difficult to shift or alter, no matter who is in office.
Well, I think that what you're describing is possible, but it hasn't happened yet. So at this moment, we have to go with what is, and every person has to go with where they feel they can help the breakthrough happen in the circumstances that now exist.
I think you're right. Thanks, Marianne. What about in the world of mental health? Big Pharma It requires that 40 million Americans stay on antidepressants. 4 in 10 lobbying dollars go to healthcare or food interests, and it seems that there's some corollary between those two things. How can you disrupt a system with so much financial investment in it and with so much systemic support?
Well, it shouldn't be a fringe or radical thing to point out that Americans appear to be over-medicated. And yet I know from my campaign last time, boy, you get anywhere near anything like that, and that's when they come after you. And I know they came after me last time. They've already come after me this time. What we have is a matrix, a corporate matrix. That's why it's often called a corporatocracy. Basically, it's a reversion to an aristocratic system. It's insurance companies, pharmaceutical companies, big food, big agriculture, big chemical companies, gun manufacturers, big oil, and defense contractors. And as long as we have profit-based healthcare system, as long as we have a profit-based, basically journalism in this country, as long as we have profit-based foreign policy, then this situation is going to be sitting on top of us. They have a grip. They are holding the U.S. government hostage, and our government, therefore, is more of a system of legalized bribery. But you have to call them on it everywhere you can, including Big Pharma, and the ultimate answer, the ultimate victory is going to be when enough people wake up and realize how systemically disinformed we are. We are mentally trained to expect too little. We are mentally trained, and Big Pharma is a perfect example. Most people who are listening right now, if they live in the United States, know somebody, if they're not already somebody, rationing their insulin, going to Mexico or going to Canada to get their insulin. Stop it with thinking these people always have your best interests at heart. Obviously, there are things done by big pharmaceutical companies that all of us are grateful for, but they are predatory in too many cases, creating profit centers as we know they did with the opioid crisis. And we should not be so naive as to think they're not doing with any other area.